Okay, this set of notes will be about thinking and problem solving, and we have some research in here that goes along with thinking and some that will go along with problem solving. So let's jump right in. We are going to start with the idea of thinking. And thinking, or cognition, refers to the idea or the process of knowing, understanding, remembering, and communicating information. So we organize our thinking in multiple different ways, and we're going to start from the top and work our way down. So concepts are the large umbrella term of things, and these are groups of objects or ideas or people, and they're similar in some sort of way. So for example, the concept of a chair is very general. There are a lot of different types of chairs, and you have very specific ideas in your mind of what fits your concept of a chair. Then we have schema, and schema are those characteristics that we were just talking about. So they are the features that make a chair a chair. So for example, a chair has 4 legs, it has a seat, it has a back. Those are the things that represent a chair to you. Then we also have what are called prototypes. Prototypes are the best example of the concept that demonstrates the schema. So it is the first thing that comes to mind when you think of the concept. So it is the chair that comes to mind when I tell you, think of a chair. It's what you picture. It's your best personal representation of that concept. And this will be different for every person because every person's schema and concepts are different. So while concepts are good and they allow us to kind of organize our different things and help us make sense of the world around us, they can also hinder our problem solving. They can hinder our ability to see new situations because they help us make snap judgments about new and novel information based on what we already know. Another idea that goes along with schema is the idea of assimilation versus accommodation. And this is how we organize new information that is coming in to our thoughts. So through the process of assimilation, this is where we will improve our existing knowledge of something thanks to that information being congruent. So the example they give here is if a child owns a poodle and they see a dachshund and they notice that it kind of looks like a poodle, the child will point to that dachshund and say, "Look, a dog." And the parent is like, "Yep, you're right. It is a dog. It's a different kind of dog called a dachshund." And now that child's schema is growing, right? It has changed to include new characteristics, different characteristics. So it's fitting information that we are learning, new information, into our already existing schema. Accommodation, however, is changing our schema or completely creating a new schema when we have information that's coming in. So for example, if that child has a poodle and they see a cat, they notice that it looks like the poodle that they have, they point at it and say, "Oh, that's a dog." The parent's like, "Ooh, no, not a dog, it's a cat." Now that child has to change its dog schema to completely exclude this 4-legged pet in general and create a new cat schema. So let's talk about some research to help us understand this idea of a schema. Brewer and Treyens were studying the role of schema in our memory. Basically, it's the idea of our prior experiences help us remember new and novel information. So these ideas of schema give us ways to understand the new stuff that's coming in. And they wanted to investigate how those schema play a role in encoding information and also retrieving information. So what they did is they took 86 university psych students and they had the students come into a room. And that room was made to look like an office setting. So it had a desk and it had bookshelves and it had chairs and pens and pencils and notepads. But it also had very odd things that wouldn't necessarily belong in an office, like a skull or pool floaty or other things that don't belong in offices. So they added things, but they also omitted important things from the room, like books that might be in an office. And the participants were told that they were just waiting for researchers to come and grab them from the room to begin the study. What they didn't know is that the study had already started. And after 35 seconds, the participant was called into another room and asked what they had remembered from the office. The participants were asked to do one of 3 types of recall. The first was written and verbal, so they would write out what they saw and explain what they saw. The second was they were given a map of the room and asked to draw different items in the room that they saw. And the third was a verbal only recall. Then, after they recalled, they were given a questionnaire and asked to mark from a list of items what they had seen in the room. Brewer and Treyens found that when participants were asked by either writing or drawing, they were more likely to remember items in the office that fit the schema of an office. So the things that you would expect to see in an office were more often recalled. The atypical items, however, things like the pool floaty or the skull, were more often identified when they were choosing items from a list. It was able to jog their memory like, oh yeah, I did see that. However, when they were identifying objects from a list, they were more likely to choose that they saw items that fit in an office that weren't actually there, like books, for example. When the participants were drawing the map of the room, they also noticed that they tended to change the nature of where objects were in the room to match where they would go according to their schema. So for example, a notepad that was actually on a chair in the room, they had put on the desk instead. So what does this tell us? Well, it tells us that the schema of an office does play a role in both the encoding of information and the retrieval of information. We are likely to remember things or encode items in a room that fit in our schema. We tend to change our retrieval of information, our recall of information based on the schema. We want it to fit in with the schema. This does tell us that schema play a giant role in our memory of situations. So some evaluation of this study. First of all, there really isn't any way for us to verify what that person's schema of an office was beforehand, because if we did, it would give away the experiment. We also can't really explain why some people remember better than others, and why some items were remembered than others. It also doesn't really indicate that there were a lot of errors. There were only a few errors that people had when they were trying to recall. How much did their schema actually influence the results? Also, we have to question whether or not this deception of not telling participants that the study had actually started is ethical. Okay, let's move on to another part of thinking, which is the dual process model of thinking. This is the idea that when we are solving problems, we have different ways of solving the problem that's put in front of us. And we call those system 1 and system 2. System 1 thinking is super fast. This is going to be your emotional, in the moment, impulsive decision making. This is based on your habits, it's based on your values, it's based on your beliefs. So when we are trying to solve a problem, this is going to be that immediate thought of what you want to do to solve the problem. It's super prone to error, but it's fast. And so a lot of people rely on this. System 2 thinking is going to be more effortful or slow and logical problem solving. This is looking at all of your different options, you're reflecting on past experiences, you're planning things out, you're thinking about the results. So this is definitely more reliable and going to get you the correct answer, but it's going to take some more time. So as we're going through the different ways to solve a problem, we're going to think about whether or not these strategies fall under system 1 thinking or system 2 thinking. The first thing we're going to talk about are algorithms. Algorithms are methodical, logical, procedural ways to solve problems. This is where you're going through every single possible option to make sure that you're getting to the correct thing. Obviously, this falls under system 2 types of thinking. Like I said, algorithms use all possibilities before they arrive at the possible solution, so that means that they're going to take a long time. Computers often use algorithms to give you exactly the type of information that you want to use because they've gone through all of the possibilities. So let's use the example of trying to find something in the grocery store. Let's say you want to find oatmeal. You're not really sure where it is. In order to find the oatmeal according to an algorithm, you would go down every single aisle back and forth looking at every single shelf to make sure that you do not miss that oatmeal. The next type of problem solving are called heuristics. And heuristics are simple strategies. They are quick and they make judgments. So heuristics are going to fall under system 1 thinking. These are mental shortcuts that allow us to make a decision on something without having to rely on every possible option. They are fast. However, because you're using quick judgments, they're often very prone to error. So if we're using the oatmeal example again, using a heuristic, you would read the signs. That's your shortcut in order to figure out which sign would have the cereal. Next, we're going to talk about 2 heuristics that have been identified by psychologists that are very often used in our daily life, and they are important for us to be able to make judgments, but they often lead to bias and stereotyping and error in our judgment and problem solving. The first is the representativeness heuristic. And this is the idea that we are judging the likelihood of something or of an object in terms of how well they seem to represent our prototype of whatever that concept is. So for example, if you were to meet a man dressed in dress slacks and a sweater who is small in stature, wears glasses, is soft-spoken and somewhat shy, and we're asked if this man were a librarian or a construction worker, which one would you say? You would probably say a librarian because he fits the concept or your prototype of a librarian more than likely. In addition, if I were to tell you about my friend Alex and how excited I am for you to meet this person, and they're very exciting and engaging, they love sports, and they're really into working out, you might develop a prototype for someone by the name of Alex. But when that person comes in and it's a female and she is Miss America, now you're questioning what you just heard, right? So we judge things based on what our brain has as the best prototype or example of that concept in order to make a decision on what it is. The next heuristic that we're going to talk about, the availability heuristic. And this is a cognitive shortcut which we make judgments about how likely an event is going to happen based on how often we hear about that event. So for example, people are often afraid of flying because they hear about plane crashes on the news. We don't hear about every single car crash, but you definitely hear about plane crashes. And so people are more scared of flying than they are of driving in a car, even though you are statistically more likely to die in a car crash than a plane crash. Another heuristic that we're going to talk about is actually not called a heuristic in this case, it's called a type of bias, and it is called anchoring bias. And anchoring bias is a cognitive shortcut, so a heuristic, where we rely heavily on the initial piece of information that we have to make a decision. So if you look at this picture on here, you can see that this person thinks the car is way too expensive when it's $30,000. However, if we see a car and it says, oh, it's on sale for $30,000, marked down from $60,000, we think it's a great deal. We rely on that piece of information that it was $60,000 and now it's $30,000 to make a decision. So let's talk about some evidence of anchoring bias. Tversky and Kahnemann wanted to test the effects of anchoring bias when estimating the value of a math problem. And this is a very simple study. What they did, they had students quickly estimate the value of 8 factorial. The difference is they wrote it out 1 times 2 times 3 times 4 times 5 times 6 times 7 times 8 versus 8 times 7 times 6 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1. So one group had the ascending condition, the other group had the descending condition. What researchers assumed is that participants would use that first number in the equation, either 1 or 8, as the anchor, as the initial piece of information to estimate the value. They guessed that people had the descending condition with 8 as their anchor, that they would estimate a higher value for the exact same problem. What they found is that the median estimate for the ascending was 512 and the descending group was 2,250. So what does this tell us? Well, it tells us that people actually did use that first number, the 1 or the 8, as a basis for what they were going to estimate the value of the math equation was. Some evaluation of this study. It's simple. It's super easy to replicate. In fact, this is often chosen as one of my IA research studies to replicate. It's very highly controlled. And so it has a lot of high internal validity, meaning they're getting very similar results if they do this over and over with different people. However, it has very low ecological validity. It's very artificial. This isn't something that people really are going to do outside in the real world. And another evaluation is that they used median to report the data, which is a good thing in this case because we really are diminishing the influence of those outliers. And because this was done as an independent sample, we know that participant variability or the differences between participant groups could have played a role in the results. For example, one group just might have been better at math, and so they are better at estimating the sum. As a follow-up to Tversky and Kahnemann's study on anchoring bias, Enlglich and Mussweiler wanted to do a more real-world study. They wanted to see if a request for a certain length of a prison sentence made by the prosecutor would influence the decision made by a judge. In other words, that request of a prison sentence would serve as the anchor, and the decision would be how long the judge actually said that the prison sentence should be. So what they did is they took 19 young trial judges, 15 male and 4 female, and they were given a case of an alleged rape. This was a made-up case, but it had all of the information that they would normally see in a case. And at the end of all of the information that they were given, the prosecutor wrote a recommendation of what the sentence would be for the person that was accused of the crime. The prosecutor either demanded a sentence of 2 months for the person or a sentence of 24 months. The participants were given the case and all of the materials along with copies of the penal code. They were asked to read the case fully and form an opinion about the case and then answer a questionnaire that went along with it. What they found was that the participants who were given the recommendation of the 2-month sentence gave a mean or average sentencing recommendation of 18.78 months, and the high anchor of 24 months was 28.7 months of an average sentence. This study also had a control group where they gave the case materials and all of the information without a recommended sentencing to a group of highly trained trial judges, and they gave an average 17.21 months for a sentence for the alleged rape. So what does this tell us? Well, it tells us that because there's a difference in the mean sentencing that each of the groups gave, it leads to the conclusion that the anchor or the recommended sentencing provided by the prosecutor before the case led to a different opinion on what the perpetrator actually should get from the judge. The only difference in the case was this recommended sentencing given by the prosecutor. All of the other details of the case remain the same. So we can make the assumption that it was this recommendation that changed people's opinion on the case. The evaluation of this study is that it is a true experiment. We have a true cause and effect. We can see that the recommendation is in fact the thing that changed the opinion of the participants in the case because everything else in the case was kept the same. This was also an independent sample study, so the participant variability or the differences among the different participants could have played a role in their opinion, maybe their background in sexual assault or other cases that they've heard in the past. Another thing to keep in mind is that this is a very small sample size, and so it's not really representative of all trial judges out there. So while we are supporting this idea that an anchor does bias our decisions, it's not the best example to generalize these findings to all people. The last way to solve problems is through insight learning, and we have talked about this already back with our learning unit. Remember the chimps who had to get the bananas from the ceiling using a stick and then a box, and then putting those two things together to figure out how to get the bananas that were twice as tall. That's insight learning, that idea of, oh, I can use my past experiences to solve a new problem. All of these ways to solve problems do sometimes give us some obstacles. Sometimes our thinking can actually get in the way of our solving problems. This happens with fixation, which is our inability to really look outside of the box. We're only looking to solve the problem through one solution and not looking for other possible solutions that could help us solve the problem quicker. And there's two different types of fixation. The first is a mental set. Our mental set is our tendency for old patterns of problem solving to make it impossible for us to find new ways to solve problems. The best example for mental set is actually children. They might have learned over time that throwing a tantrum gets them what they want. And now they're in school or they go to daycare and they're not getting what they want from their teacher. And so they do what they know to get what they want. They throw a tantrum, they throw a fit. Teachers are more skilled when dealing with toddlers, and so they don't give in to the tantrum. Now that toddler is unable to get over or find a new way to get what they want because they're so set on using that tantrum to solve their problem. The next type of fixation is called functional fixedness. And this is the tendency to think of only the familiar or typical functions of an object. So for example, if you're trying to open a box from Amazon and all you have around you is a spoon, you're like, I don't have a knife, I don't have scissors, I can't open this box. All I have is this spoon. Well, you didn't think about maybe turning the spoon over and using the handle of the spoon to open the box or the edge of the spoon to open the box. It's not being able to overcome the typical function of that spoon to solve a new problem. Another thing that can hinder our problem solving is bias. And one of the most important types of bias that we can talk about is confirmation bias. You see this every single day of your life, all over social media, all over the political landscape right now, and that is confirmation bias. And this is the idea that we have a tendency to search for information that confirms your belief. Think about it this way. If I believe that Taylor Swift is the best artist out there, which she is, obviously, I'm only going to look up pieces of evidence that are going to support the idea that she is the best. I am not going to look for evidence that maybe she's not so great. We do this a lot when it comes to research in school, right? If you are trying to solve a historical question or a literary question, you're going to look for evidence that best serves your argument. You're going to kind of leave out that evidence that doesn't help answer your question. Other examples of bias that hinder our ability to solve problems are belief bias. And this is the idea that our pre-existing beliefs often distort our ability to logically reason through a problem. Let's say you used Vicks Vapor Rub all of the time when you were a kid to get rid of your stuffy nose. Then you're reading some research and it says, yep, Vicks Vapor Rub has healing properties. You're like, absolutely, that's true. It always worked for me. So this is that you're likely to believe things that back up your pre-existing beliefs. Belief bias can also sometimes lead to illogical conclusions or incorrect conclusions when solving a problem. For example, if you believe that one way is correct and someone does it a different way, you might say that they haven't done it as well or they don't have as much knowledge because they're not doing it the way that you always have done. This also goes along with the idea of belief perseverance. And this is our tendency to cling to our beliefs or values in the face of contrary evidence. This happens all the time. If you have a specific belief about your body or a friend believes that she is fat, it doesn't matter how many times that you tell her that she looks beautiful or how much weight she loses, she's still going to see herself as fat. Again, this happens in the political sphere all the time. When a piece of information comes out and it doesn't back up what you believe or doesn't help support the person that you believe, you're going to discount that as misinformation or false because you're not willing to give up your strongly held beliefs. So let's talk about how all of these are different. Confirmation bias is that you are seeking out information that's only going to support your consciously held belief or your bias, right? You're looking for evidence that's only going to support your idea. Belief bias is that your beliefs or your ideas actually change the way that you make conclusions. And sometimes those conclusions are wrong, or you're going to reject the logical conclusions because it contradicts what you believe. And then finally, belief perseverance is the idea that even though contradicting evidence is obvious or provided for you, and you might even acknowledge that that information is there, but you're still going to stick with your beliefs because they're so strongly held. Let's talk about a couple of other obstacles to solving problems. The first is overconfidence. And overconfidence is our tendency to overestimate the accuracy of one's belief or judgment. Now, this isn't always a bad thing. Sometimes overconfidence leads to more happiness. It keeps us from thinking of all of the bad things that can end up happening or worrying that things might not work out. Sometimes this overconfidence or this belief that you're going to solve the problem is going to keep you going. So an example of overconfidence is when you are trying to meet a goal. You set an end date for that goal and you're like, yep, I'm going to get this done by next week, Tuesday. And then you realize, oh wait, I have practice and I have work and I have to hang out with that person and I have to hang out with this person and I have to go to school. And it takes you a little bit longer than you originally thought. Now, it is you being overconfident. You thought you could get something done in a shorter amount of time than you actually did. But it did push you to get it done because you were looking at that end date and saying, shoot, I need to get this done. I need to do it. I'm already past when I said I was going to get it done. So even though we are, looking at the glass half full and thinking we can do things quickly, we are still going to get it done eventually. The next obstacle to problem solving is the idea of exaggerated fear. And this is actually opposed to overconfidence. And this is our tendency to kind of look at things like glass half empty. So, for example, think of a lot of people's responses after a major tragedy. For example, 9/11. Many people chose not to fly for a long time after the 9/11 attacks because they were so afraid of what would have happened. And these ideas of overconfidence and exaggerated fear are sometimes used in a way to change how we view a situation. And this is what framing is. If an issue is presented in a certain way, it can significantly affect the decisions or the judgments that you make about the particular issue. If I present an issue one way, it can sound a completely different way than if I presented a second. The more positive you make the issue sound, the more people will respond to it. For example, what's the best way to market ground beef? Am I going to market ground beef as 25% fat or 75% lean? Am I going to say that a surgery has a 90% success rate or a 10% failure? Framing a situation in a certain way can definitely change the way that someone's going about making a decision or solving a problem. So let's talk about the difference between framing and priming. These are two ideas that help us make decisions about a situation, but they are a little bit different. So framing is how I present the situation itself. So it's the lenses which you're looking through something that's going to alter your response. So it's a rose-colored glasses question or it's a dark and dreary kind of question. Priming is kind of leading you into thinking a certain way. So for example, if I'm setting the mood by setting some music or turning the lights down, I'm priming you to think very calm thoughts, but I'm not actually asking you a question in a calm way. So framing is going to be how the question is specifically worded. So would you like to donate $1 to help children in need? Versus me being very bubbly and kind to you and complimenting you and then asking you to donate $1. So framing is how I actually phrase the question. Priming is what I do before the question is asked.